Hey everybody, welcome back to Historians of the Movies podcast. I am your host and creator, Jason Herbert, and every single week we are talking about movies and the histories behind them. And this week we are traveling back to World War II. I've invited on our old friend, Waitman Beorn. Waitman is a scholar of World War II and more specifically of the Holocaust, to talk about the film Defiance. If you're familiar with this film, it came out in 2008, directed by our friend Ed Zwick and starring Daniel Craig and Liev Schreiber and Jamie Bell as the Bielski brothers, Polish partisans who helped fend off the Nazi attack during World War II in Belarus. This is an incredibly powerful film that really couples with Waitman's powerful work talking about the genocide and Holocaust occurring in Central Europe during World War II. So I love this film, and I just love Waitman. He's one of my best buddies, and I hope that you enjoy this conversation. It's a deep dive into something that's really difficult to talk about, but it's a fun film, and I think it offers us a chance to really get into some really important history today. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Sit back and relax, because Defiance is next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Waitman Beorn, welcome to tomorrow.
It is. Tomorrow's today.
I know. I was just wondering a second ago before you messaged, you're like, is Waitman coming or not? And then, because, it's not fair. I feel bad because it's midnight where you are right now, but maybe you're fired up. Maybe you're in a maybe your juices are flowing to talk about this movie now.
I live for my craft, so I'm happy to sacrifice for you.
Well, the problem is you're in Northumbria. You're in England. Where is Northumbria in the UK?
So it's on the north. It's in the northeast of England. It's about an hour south, or where I am is about an hour south of the Scottish border. More or less, Newcastle is kind of like right on the North Sea, more or less, by a few miles. So I'm above the wall, and for people who live in London, I'm on the North Pole.
Well, I meant to say, welcome back. This is your third pod.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, you've done some really downer shit on this podcast
well,
before.
That's kind of my brand. My brand is downer shit. The Holocaust is not usually a sort of uplifting topic. Though, to be fair, what we're talking about today and parts of my recent research have at least some killing Nazis part of them, which is always good.
Well, there's the killing Nazis part, and then there's the mere survival in the face of overwhelming odds, right?
Correct.
Ultimately, I think that's the big part of this film. The idea of defiance is just the ability to live when you break it down to this film. And this is a film I like very much. This is kind of weird because, the first time you came on the pod, we did Fury, which I think is actually low-key one of the best World War II action films.
Yeah.
Out there. I love this movie. It's so much fun. And then we did some other movie, Gettysburg. I'd only heard of it once or twice, about this thing, the Civil War, something like that happened in America. I feel like you're due for the holiday, right? I guess, right? I feel like we're due for the holiday or the Grinch or something else. You're due for something happy, because this is also not a really happy film. This is cold. Actually, the holiday is cold too. We need to find something to warm.
I just, I'm not really sure happy is my jam when it comes to scholarship and movies.
Well, this is not a happy film, but let's do it anyway. You want to introduce yourself to the people who haven't heard you the first few times around?
Yeah. So I'm Waitman Beorn. I am a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, associate professor at Northumbria University here in beautiful northeast of England. I did my undergrad at West Point, and I did my graduate work at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. My first book was on the German Army and the Holocaust, and then I wrote a book on the Holocaust in Eastern Europe. Just finished a book on a place called Yanovska in Ukraine. And I also have my own podcast as well. It's the Holocaust History Podcast, where every week I talk to someone really smart about various topics related to the Holocaust.
Well, I wanted to ask you, when we started thinking about your new book here, Between the Wires, the Yanovska camp, was I pronounced this correct?
Yeah.
Yanovska right. Camp, and the Holocaust in Lviv. There's no shortage of World War II films. and there's no shortage, frankly, of Holocaust films. And you were like, let's do Defiance. Why Defiance of all the films? Why are we talking about this Daniel Craig film?
I mean, to be honest, it's not my favorite Holocaust film. Um,
Do
but
people have favorite Holocaust films?
well, I mean, okay, in my world, audience, imagine Waitman holding up scare quotes because I basically live my life in scare quotes.
Sure.
I have my favorite Holocaust survivor who has like amazing testimonies, but again, that sounds kind of weird if this isn't something you sort of always
No, I
do.
get it.
So, like, I would have suggested something like Son of Saul, which I think is a really amazing film. It's the directing is amazing, the cinematography is amazing, the sound work is phenomenal, but it's just massively violent um, and depressing, frankly. And you basically made it clear that you didn't think that the audience wanted to hear someone talk about an incredibly depressing movie for an hour or 2 hours. So
Not as
I
much.
steered us. I
No.
steered us to something that is sort of maybe a little more mainstream,
Mhm.
and also, while it's brutal and awful in parts, there are some positive moments, and it's not 100% sort of all grinding agony the whole time.
No, I feel like this is like Bill Simmons would call this a rewatchable film. Like I was like, all right, yeah. When we decided on this, like, yeah, I because I'll usually rewatch the film before we do the pod. I was like, all right, I'll turn it on last night, rewatch it again, just get it fresh in my mind, things like that. And it's a film that you can do that. There are certainly certain films out there. When we did 12 Years a Slave, that's not a movie I ever want to watch again. Despite the fact that it covers a lot of the same themes, surviving throughout tremendous, struggle and all of these different things, right? This is a movie. I don't know. Wait, it kind of feels at times Robin Hood ish to me. There's the aspect of these people, these men and women who go and live in the forest, and they're kind of scrounging out. As I was kind of watching, the way the story is told. I don't know how realistic this is as far as from reality and things like that, but I can kind of see director Ed Zwick kind of going, okay, beat for beat, this is how we're going to tell the story, and the decisions he was making to kind of to make this frankly a movie that you could watch more than once to kind of take in the larger points he's trying to make about survival against overwhelming odds and things. Can we talk a little bit about the Bilski brothers? You work in the Holocaust. You're a professor of it. You've written all these books on Holocaust. You've got the pod. Before this film comes out in 2009, I've never heard of the Bielski brothers before. Are they well known inside of Europe or inside of, say, Holocaust studies or studies of World War II, or was this a thing that that Zwick kind of picked out of nowhere from this book that comes out in 1993? Like how well is this story known?
Well, I mean, I think it's kind of like ripples on a pond where there are circles, and within certain circles, things are more or less well known. I think certainly within the scholarly Holocaust community, which doesn't always overlap well with the general public. This is something that was known, and then Nahama Tech's book Defiance of the same name, which is the book that the movie is based on, really brought it to prominence. I think at a certain level in the public, and of course, Nahama Tech was an amazing scholar herself a survivor of the Holocaust, rescued by Poles. She wrote another book, When Light Pierced the Darkness, which is all about rescuers. It's a really, really amazing book as well, and looking into sort of what led people to become rescuers, to kind of an attempt to create a collective biography of who a rescuer is, at least in the Polish context. But it's one of those things where it helped that Daniel Craig, is cast as the lead, and so it becomes more well known after that. But I'm not sure it was like super well known. They were super well known, outside of that. In Jewish communities, for example, in certain places, resistance, particularly armed resistance, is obviously something that people remember and sort of keep alive. So I think, in that sense, it's well known again in those communities, but all these communities are kind of like intersecting Venn diagrams, and they don't always overlap.
Let me ask you about the Bielski brothers here, because I got a little confused on the placement. Belarus is not a place that Americans spend a lot of time thinking about most normally. Um, the brothers are Polish. They're Belarusian. Who are the brothers?
So the Bielski family and the Bielski brothers, um, are essentially. So let me go back. Let me go back to Belarus, because you're right. Belarus is
Sure.
something that is sort of an unclear area, I think, for a lot of people. Belarus, as the Soviet Socialist Republic of Belarus, which then becomes the state of Belarus, um, doesn't exist until the Soviets create it in 1939. I mean, it does, right? There is a Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic um, that is a part of the Soviet Union pre 1939. And then when the Soviets invade Poland in 1939, they take over the eastern half of Poland.
Mm.
And so Belarus then, and again, it's still the Soviet Socialist Republic of Belarus, so it's still just a Soviet state. It's not an independent country. It doesn't have a really history of being an independent country. But the Soviet Socialist Republic of Belarus is 1939 on made up of half of the terrain was Eastern Poland.
Okay.
And the other half was, pre-war Belarus, and which actually has some interesting effects, in terms of, the degree to which populations were Sovietized and not, right? But the area in which the Bielskis grew up would have been part of Novogrudok, for example, the Novogrudok ghetto, and the Novogrudok, the city, was part of Eastern Poland.
Okay.
And Lida, then all those areas where they sort of are, you don't get that necessarily in the film, but those areas would have been Eastern Poland, and so the people that live there are Polish, because Belarusian as an ethnicity is sort of very much kind of a malleable thing that is sort of changing, right? Because the area of Poland, or what constitutes Belarus today, for example, contains parts of Lithuania, what have been historically been Lithuania, Poland, and Ukraine in the south. So it's kind of a mix of areas, and it's not, for example, it doesn't have the really strong sort of nationalist histories that the Baltic states have, that Poland has, that Ukraine has.
So we jump into this film very, very quickly as far as the invasion into Poland, and we see that the Bielski brothers family, the Bielski family, the mother and father are killed very quickly into this film, and the movie moves really fast into getting the brothers into the forest. I guess this place that they knew, and I'm wondering, as you've studied the Holocaust, is this a unique story of people who flee into the woods in Europe? Are there other situations like this where there were refugee communities who were being hunted down? I think the Nazis had tried to hunt these guys down for several years. Is this an isolated case, Waitman, or is this fairly common?
So it's much more common in Eastern Europe, obviously, than it is in Western Europe, for a variety of reasons. One of which, again, is that Western Europe, relatively speaking, has a much smaller Jewish population, and they tend to be much more urban based, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas Eastern Europe, you have Jews all over the place in little villages, as well as in large cities, but just the scale of the Jewish population is just fundamentally different. So, for example, the city of Lviv, that I wrote the book about, had a Jewish population of around 160,000, which is more than all the Jews in the Netherlands, for example. And that's in one city. Belarus, in particular, has these wide swaths of forests that are available, as does Ukraine, and as does parts of Poland. And so, for many people, fleeing to the forest was really the only option that they had. When I did my research for the first book, because my first book was set in Belarus, that's where the German army units that I investigated were, and I went to a little town called Krupki, which is where one of the German army units had murdered 1,000 Jews in the city, in the village. And we went out to interview this old lady who lived like a half mile from the killing site. and she was old and widowed, and lived in this wonderful little sort of bright green painted house. And I wanted to talk to her about what she witnessed as a girl, because she had climbed up on the roof and she had witnessed some of this killing as a girl. And before she began to talk about that, she wanted to tell me her family story. She wasn't Jewish; she was Belarusian. And of course, I said, "Sure, tell me." And so, her family story was that her father and brother were burned to death by the Germans in a barn. Her mother died in a small concentration camp in Belarus. Her other brother had died at the front, fighting with the Red Army, and she and her aunt had fled to the forest and lived in the forest during the war years to survive. And I don't think that is a particularly uncommon family experience in Belarus. Belarus, between 1941 and 1944, this is Tim Snyder's words, but it's the most deadly place on earth. When you combine the war, so the casualties taking place in actual fighting, when you combine the Holocaust with all of the other associated the Nazi occupation's violence and sort of mass killing programs, wiping out villages, starving populations, reprisals for partisan attacks, all these things, it's just massively a massively devastating place, to the extent that something like 10% of the population is killed during the war. So the forests, were often your best shot, because remember, this was Eastern Poland, and so if you fled to another village, that village may not be a super safe place either, because there were a number of Poles who were anti-Semitic that were willing to sort of turn people in, or were afraid of themselves getting attacked by the Germans if they did so. So yeah, it's the forest then becomes a place where some of these people can go, though it's rarer for sort of entire families. This family camp that the Bielski brothers established is a much rarer thing than individuals hiding out in the forests. But even non-Jewish populations would do this as well. Sometimes they would, if they saw the Germans coming to town, they would just go hide in the forest for several days until they came back. So it's probably a much more common phenomenon in Eastern Europe than it is in anywhere else.
And forgive me, because I'm certainly not a World War II scholar, not a Holocaust scholar, but are people aware of the German atrocities before the Nazis, say, invade a town or a region or things like that? Are people fleeing ahead of the German advances, or are they doing so like directly in response to the German arrival?
It's a great question. I mean, and it really depends on when we're talking. I can give you an example from my book. When the Soviets take over half of Poland in 1939, for a number of Jews that are in that Eastern occupied territory, they're actually rather happy that it's the Soviets. They're kind of familiar with what the Nazis are doing, and the Soviets, the Soviet Union is really the only sort of modern state in that time period that was at least officially against anti-Semitism. Because in Soviet communist doctrine, right, it's class is the distinguishing feature, not race. So they didn't recognize races and religions, and they really did in some ways oppose, at least officially state they were opposed to anti-Semitism. So there are lots of Jews in Eastern Poland that were sort of happy. Hey, at least it's not the Germans. This isn't true for everybody. If you're an observant Jew, i.e., religious, the Soviets are no good. They're trying to close down synagogues. They're taxing, religious organizations. If you are someone in the government, the Soviets were targeting people for deportation. So plenty of Jews from Eastern Poland, and will become Belarus, are deported to the gulags. And ironically, most Jews that survived the German occupation were those that were deported from that territory before the Germans arrived and ended up in the gulag. Those that survived the gulags. On the other hand, it's interesting because there's a story this is one of the stories that came out from survivors in the book. there's a joke that, there's two trains passing, and one's coming from German occupied territory to Soviet occupied territory, and one's going from Soviet occupied territory back to German territory. And there's Jews on both of them. And as they're passing, they go, "Bist du Meshugana," which means, "Are you crazy?" to each other. Each thinking that the other one is crazy for doing the wrong thing. And so we also have to remember, right, that these people are, they don't have the knowledge that we do. They don't know what's coming. So everybody's trying to sort of make a decision, the best choice they can make at the time, and they don't have a great deal of good information to go by. I mean, they may know what was happening in Germany. They may have even heard of some of the atrocities in Poland in 1939. But there's a large number of Jews in Eastern Europe who had experienced German occupation in World War I, which actually wasn't that bad. The Germans were sort of very paternalistic and colonialistic, and they wanted to bring culture to these sort of everybody, not just Jews, but all the Eastern Europeans. They sort of saw as these kind of backwards people. But they, were by and large relatively well behaved, and certainly were not trying to persecute the Jews sort of en masse the way the Nazis are. So I mean, yeah. Go ahead.
I'm guessing, is it possible they were thinking, okay, well, we've seen this before. Like, it sucked last time, but we can deal with it.
Yeah.
We'll get through it kind of mindset.
One of the fundamental things to remember about the Holocaust in general and Jewish resistance to the Holocaust in general is that, Jews have had a very long history of resisting persecution and pogroms and, discrimination and violent attacks. But usually these things are, sort of relatively, limited and short duration, at least in terms of sort of extreme violence. And the arc of history in terms of sort of Jewish rights and Jewish emancipation generally has bent towards a progressive outcome. Jews have tended over the arc of history to get more acceptance, more legal rights, etc. And so, the tactics that they normally use, from the Middle Ages on is kind of like, okay, batten down the hatches, circle the wagons, and, defend yourself when you have to, but just kind of keep your head down, and eventually this will blow over and, things will get back to normal, which was generally the case, right, up until the Nazis. The problem is that the Nazis represent a fundamentally different threat, which is a threat that is ultimately attempting to eradicate them completely, physically, to murder all of them, which is not something that they had faced before. And so many of their sort of strategies that they had used in the past are not going to work, because whether you keep your head down or not, they're going to try to round you up and murder you or send you off to an extermination center. A lot of the early period of the Holocaust, and you see this somewhat in the film, with the ghetto scenes, leaders are trying to figure out how do we manage our communities, how do we take care of our communities in the face of this threat, which we're still trying to figure out exactly what it means and what its internal logic is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there's any way you can conceptualize what's coming, because what's coming is so awful. Like you said, we'd seen German occupation before, and this turns out to be something on a scale that I don't think anybody was expecting. I think one of the fascinating things as I was rewatching this film, though, was really showing as the movie moves on, and Zeus goes to join up with the Russian partisan with the Red Army, right, and seeing really that treatment the treatment towards Jews on the part of the Russians. And I wasn't aware, Waitman, of course, I've had heard of pogroms, but I wasn't really thinking about that in terms of World War II. Can we talk a little bit more about just the ways, the Russian stance or the Soviet stance towards Judaism? Or is this an anti-religious movement on the part of the Soviets, or is it just anti-Jewish? Like, what's this positionality? Because it's clear that the Soviets will help accept these guys in because they're more hands to hold guns, but really don't have an affinity for them either. Correct?
Yeah, I mean it's challenging, right? And one of the hard things to pick apart is the ideology and the reality, right? Because again, as I said, ideologically speaking, communism is against anti-Semitism, against all forms of racism, because it views those as sort of dividing the people alongside these sort of categories that are not. They don't communism as an ideology, and I'm not trying to sort of cheerlead for communism. But communism as an ideology doesn't value people based on race. Nazism does. Right? Nazism values the world. It arranges the world by racial categories. Communism, at least ideologically, arranges the world via class. Whether you're the proletariat or you're a kulak or you're the bourgeoisie, right? These are the evil capitalists. Like, this is how the world is arranged, which has its benefits in terms of discrimination, because you can sort of change your stripes in a way that you can't if the world is organized genetically, essentially. There are some quite prominent leaders in the Communist Party in the Soviet Union who were Jewish. Karl Marx was Jewish. Trotsky was Jewish. Some of the high-ranking officials were Jewish. Now, they probably wouldn't consider themselves Jewish. They're Jewish by our definitions, but Karl Marx actually said lots of anti-Semitic things as well. Jewishness was not something that they sort of wore on their sleeve. It obviously, communism is also anti-Judaism. It's anti-Christianity. It's it's anti all religions, and that's the ideal. But certainly, Russians have a long history of anti-Semitism. Poles have a long history of anti-Semitism. Ukrainians have a long history of anti-Semitism. All these areas, anti-Semitism is something that is sort of organic to the populations, and that doesn't just go away, because of the Soviet Union. And so, for example, the Soviet partisans depicted, in the film, yes, they're Soviets, but they're also Russians. And what you're seeing there is sort of the anti-Semitism underlying the sort of ideology of the Red Army and of communism. And you see that with sort of on the one hand, the characters in the film were sort of saying, look, you can't treat us like this because we're all Soviets together. But then ultimately, when the rubber hits the road, the insults come out and the slurs and everything else. And so, one of the challenges that Jews faced when they were fleeing to the forest with the aim of joining the partisans was, which partisan group are we going to find? Because actually, throughout occupied Eastern Europe, there were lots of different partisan groups after a certain time, but they're not all the same. So, you might run into a group of Polish partisans fighting with the Home Army, the Polish Home Army, and they could be just as anti-Semitic as everybody else. And they, they could be just as likely to kill you because you're a Jew as they were to kill the Germans. You could run into a Ukrainian group for the same reason. You could run into a Soviet group, which may be very happy to have you, or one that's led by somebody who is more anti-Semitic and is less likely to have you. It was happy to have you. And so it really was sort of a crapshoot about who you get. And of course, in some parts of Eastern Europe during the war, some of these partisan groups were fighting each other and the Nazis at the same time. So things get really sort of complex in that sense. And that's just sort of, and then if you're a woman, of course, it makes it even more difficult, right? Because most of these groups don't really want to see women fighting. So you don't have a really good chance if you can't provide something for the partisan group. And that could be as awful as sort of instrumental rape or sort of being forced into that kind of relationship, or it could be as not great either, but you're relegated to sort of traditionally gendered female roles like cooking and nursing and this kind of stuff, which you may not want to do either. And then overlaid on top of all of this, one of the challenges for all these people trying to get into the forest and join up with a partisan group is, if you don't have a weapon, many of them just won't take you at best if they don't kill you, right? Because what's the point? Like, weapons are at a premium for these partisan groups, and they really want you to show up with a weapon so that you can actually contribute, to the effort. And sometimes, again, like I guess I'm being dreary again, but sometimes you could have a weapon, But if you meet the wrong partisan group, they kill you and take your weapon and give it to somebody in their group. And there's an example. I think it was one of the guys that I interviewed or that I read about for the book, his testimony, and he joins up one of these partisan groups after he escapes from the Yanovsky camp, which we should talk about later. But he joins up this group, and he goes on some of these partisan raids, and one of the raids he's kind of out front, and he notices that the bullets are kind of landing near him, but they're coming from behind. So like his own guys are kind of like shooting at him, and so he's like, in his testimony, he's kind of like, and then I decided, well, I'm out of here, and sort of like melts away and leaves that group, right? Because even then, he wasn't quite sure that he was belonging. So it's kind of a long answer, to a short question, but I just want to highlight the difficulties just in sort of very basic, survival strategies for Jews in this part of the world.
I actually want to talk about Jewish women in this film. They do play a very large role. The focus is on the brothers, but the brothers all take wives. They all have relationships. So the role of women in the camp is a big one. And I know the film took a little heat on its treatment of this as far as deviating from the ways that the Bilskis kind of arrange things and stuff like that. So first I want to talk about, there are different rules here for these forced marriages. I don't even know what to call them. Waitman, how do we term these war marriages for protection marriages? What is this?
I mean, it's difficult to generalize without sort of, again, making kind of a sweeping judgment of the whole thing. And so
Sure.
They are sort of, I guess the best way of approaching them is sort of saying that they mean different things to different people in different areas at different times, which is a terrible answer, but it's a very historian sort of answer. And I'll flesh it out a little bit in the sense that, in some places, this is instrumental sex. It's a woman who has something that she recognizes that she can trade to keep her alive and keep her in a safe situation. And there may be, very little if to none romance into this, and maybe even often can kind of slide into the area of coercion. So, these things, these forced marriages, have kind of a dark underbelly to them as well in some places and times, because it can be very much sort of like, I choose one man to be with to prevent me from being sort of passed around to lots of different men without my without my consent. And so and of course this is a place where there is, in some of these situations, where there is very limited agency. And these women are choosing to they're making the best choice they can, what Lawrence Langer calls a choiceless choice. It's no option is great here, and they're making the best ones. Like this happens also in the camps as well. It's sort of a more constrained sort of environment. But that's not all of them. There's a woman that I remember when I was a graduate student. Chris Browning used to bring her every year to talk to his students, and her name was Faye Schulman. And Faye Schulman was this little tiny woman who would come, and she would come to the front of the class, and we'd all kind of be looking at her, and we kind of would be assuming, or at least the students would all kind of be assuming the story that she was going to tell them. And then she tells them she was a partisan, and she had joined the partisans, and they told her that you can't, do anything except sort of sit in the camp and do woman stuff. And she's like, nope, not doing that. And she ended up, helping to blow up trains, and like she was a sniper and all this other stuff. And she's amazing picture of her in the forest with like a sniper rifle and this like amazing fur coat on. But she had a boyfriend, and it was like in her scenario, it was a love relationship, and so it was people finding each other, at a time of sort of high stress, in the forest and sort of joining up together, which I don't think we need to downplay either. That there are these people who are, living at a very emotionally fraught time, and they may be looking for companionship, something to sort of help them through that. So it's really hard to generalize, what we should think about these marriages. Certainly I don't think we need to judge the people the women, for making the choices that they made in them. And even in the movie, you can see sort of, hints of like some of these relationships seem to be a lot more kind of like the younger Belsky brother falls in love with that girl.
Mm-hmm.
And that seemed to be very much like a love story. Whereas the older ones do seem to be volunteering into the situation, but for very sort of pragmatic reasons. And then you have the guy who wants to get with the younger guy's girlfriend, who sort of represents the sort of more sexual violence side of things and the more sort of assault side of things.
Yeah, I guess the film, one of the ways, you coined this great term, rivet counting, that I always try to give you credit for whenever I talk about this, because that's not ultimately what we're trying to do here. But there are some decisions made in this film that really kind of depart from this, because Edward Zwick, who I really, really like, I've talked to him a couple of times, and he's just wonderful human, talks about this. He goes, the Bielski brothers weren't perfect humans. They were incredibly conflicted. They're humans, right? At the same time, there are choices made in the film, such as, look, the fighting men, I guess the armed men did kind of get preferential treatment, despite what the film would actually show you as far as food or access, frankly, to women. As I'm reading through the notes here on the film, does that hurt, Waitman, the story or our depictions? I mean, what happens if we show a more complex version of who, say, Tuvia Bielski was versus, say, really this kind of, he's saintly in this film in a lot of ways?
I think that in this film, at least the way that Zwick films it, Zeus provides this sort of the anti-hero to
the
this,
Liev
right?
Schreiber character, sure.
That's the Liev Schreiber character, right? And I think maybe what you have is a cinematic technique of dividing the complexity of individuals into being represented completely by one individual and one by the other, right? Because I think you're right. I hadn't thought about it this way, but Tuvia he doesn't really do anything bad in the film.
No,
he's kind of the guy that's level-headed, making all the good decisions. Zeus is the one that is depicted, at least, as the one that is kind of a little bit more edgy,
a little darker,
and the one sort of
right,
little harder guy. And then sort of the boy, the younger brother, is there as sort of the vehicle for us to kind of experience all these things together. I think in general, as an historian of the Holocaust, I don't think we are served by making a Scooby-Doo ending where there isn't a Scooby-Doo ending. And so, I think it's okay to be complex. I think it's okay to recognize that, during the Holocaust, even among the victim groups, there were good people, bad people, people that were good in one moment and bad in another. Because as I've said before, when the Nazis as an organization are trying to murder an entire group of people, you get an entire cross section of society. You get the amazing heroes, you get, the saints and the sort of, wonderful people, you get the child molesters and the criminals and everybody in between, and that's just a function of it. And they don't stop being those things, simply because they're undergoing this genocide. And so I think actually, it's good to show these difficult relationships. I think for the sake of the film, it's probably also was a good choice to just kind of place those in individual characters, because even amongst the people in the family camp, the other people, not sort of the main Bielskis, you sort of had these kind of like archetypal characters, right? You have like the rabbi, you have like the academic who's completely useless at the beginning, right? You have the communist, like the labor guy, the sort of unionist, Marxist guy, and they're all, and obviously those people existed, but it's sort of like Noah's Ark, whereas you have one of each to sort of identify
each character is an archetype.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, I think for someone that isn't familiar with the history, they are exceptionally good vehicles for showing the diversity of the Jewish community, in Eastern Europe, and the fact that, during the Holocaust, they have to get together and work together. and figure out a way to work together. And also that they don't always work together, and they sometimes they're pulling in different directions. And the ghetto scene I thought was a really good example of that.
Yeah, I want to depart from the forest for a minute. We're going to come back to the film in just a second, but I want to kind of depart and kind of give our listeners maybe a side narrative, if you will, as far as, we know that we've got this group of survivors who are doing their best to survive in the forest. I think a lot of American audiences are probably familiar with concentration camps generally, things like Auschwitz or Dachau or places like that. You don't write about this place in this new book. You're writing about a place that I've never heard of, Yanovska. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose to write about this particular camp? What made that, say, different or similar than other places? Why write the story of this space, and how is this story different or similar to maybe other places that our listeners are familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the question. So I say that sort of Yanovska is the most important Holocaust place you've never heard of, and I think that's true for most people, and actually for a lot of, I think, Holocaust scholars as well. And when I came upon it, I don't say discovered it, because actually there's been, in some ways, it's I didn't discover it, obviously, right? People have written about it before. When the way that I came about finding it was that when I was writing the first book, as you do, you sort of take down notes of all different things, and I noted a case of a German Army motor pool unit that had been using slave labor to fix its vehicles in Lviv, and I kind of put that to the side. That might be interesting to write about later. And so when I came back to writing a book project, I started looking at my old notes. And I thought, okay, maybe I'll write about this motor pool unit. And then I found out that these slave laborers came from this place called Yanovska, which I'd never heard of. And so I started looking into it, and I was like, wow, this is a really fascinating and important place. And I started looking around, as we do, again, to sort of see, is this a viable topic to write about? Has somebody written about it? And really nobody has. Some great German scholars, Dieter Pohl and Thomas Sandkuhler, wrote some sort of book chaptery things about it. But in terms of like the scholarly world, there's no monograph on it. There's no book in English about it, which is really ironic also, considering the fact that survivors have written quite a number of memoirs. And, one of the survivors of the camp testified at the Eichmann trial. He's quite prominent, sort of telling his story. Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter, was a prisoner in the camp. And he talks about it a little bit in his memoirs. So again, I did not discover this place. I didn't this is one of those like the never before untold amazing story of, right?
The untold story of, yeah.
Yeah, sure. I'm not doing that, and I don't like that. But it is a story that hasn't really been written, at least in English, as sort of a scholarly study. And the more I started looking into it, the more I realized what a really interesting and important place Yanovska was. It was an urban camp. It's basically sits in the city of Lviv. It's about 20-minute walk from downtown. It sat at the intersection of the Holocaust in what was known as Galicia, Eastern Galicia, which was a part of Poland. District Galician was the Nazi sort of administrative state, the district. And it sat at the center of that, both geographically and in terms of importance. The trains going to the Belzec extermination center were built, were assembled in the camp, and the camp served this sort of role as a slave labor reservoir for a variety of different Nazi things. Everything from the German army was using the Jews from the camp. The Luftwaffe was, various businesses, the city gardening department. Everything was coming from there. It also was, I mentioned sort of its transit position, but it also was a killing site, and it was a killing site from the beginning, really. And when you start adding up the numbers of people that are murdered there, it's somewhere between 40 and 80,000. And if the 80,000 number is correct, it puts it numerically above places that we've all heard of, like Dachau, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, all these places. Even puts it above the camp of Majdanek, which for a long time was included as sort of in the same sentence with Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belarus, Chelmno, the extermination centers. And again, like this isn't a suffering Olympics thing where it sort of, it's better than other camps because you had more
Right.
people.
Of course.
Just that it,
right.
it didn't, it isn't mentioned. It's unheard of. It's not. It doesn't play a major role in our understanding, of the Holocaust, or hasn't for a lot of people. And that all of that in and of itself is really interesting. And then the more I got into it, I realized even more amazing things. Like there's actually a prisoner uprising in the camp, 2 of them, and the prisoners are able to kill several SS guards and escape. So really, there's just all kinds of, the camp sort of represents an ability to talk about almost every aspect of the Holocaust. There's an amazing cultural life that takes place in the camp with the prisoners, because again, like I mentioned, it's a cross-section of society, and Lviv as a city was sort of a cosmopolitan place. It was called the Vienna of the East, and it's full of poets and artists and musicians, and many of them end up in the camp, and many of them end up trying to sort of keep at their craft, in the face of sort of Nazi oppression. And then you also have this group of really, really sadistic and brutal SS men, but that we know a fair amount about, all in this one place, this very, very small place, that I think is really important. And so that's kind of the intro to sort of the book. But there's just so much going on in that place, that I became really sort of obsessed with, just everything about the camp, and where were the things, and where were the buildings, and where were people, what were they doing, and just one of the downfalls of sort of being an historian sometimes is that you never want to stop the research and start the writing. And so I was just like, I would keep finding things, finding testimonies, making connections. I discovered that some of the SS men knew each other before the war, worked in the same factory with each other. So what does that mean for their relationships, when they become guards in this place? Anyway, I'll be quiet, but I mean, there's just so much there that's sort of really fascinating.
Now, wait, who was being interned at this camp? Who was being held prisoner? Was this men and women and children? Were these exclusively Jewish people? Were these who ended up here at this particular camp?
So it's almost entirely Jewish populations.
Okay.
It's really 2 camps that are sort of referred to as Janowska under the umbrella. The first one was the so-called DAW, the Deutsche Ausrüstungswerke, or German Equipment Works Factory. And it was initially taking men from the ghetto who would come in during the day, work, and then go back to the ghetto at night. And eventually the commandant just sort of, after they built their own barracks and built their own fences, he locks them in, and they become the first prisoner population.
Wow.
The prisoner population is predominantly men, though a women's camp is added in 1943. The second part of the camp, the Zwangsarbeitslager, the forced labor camp, which is sort of the one that is associated with a lot of the worst history of the camp, is established actually by the deputy of the commandant of the first place. These 2 guys hated each other. They didn't get along. Wilhaus and Gebauer. Gebauer was the commandant of the DAW, and Wilhaus was his second in command. And Wilhaus basically was approached the SS general in the city, and for sort of reasons of politics and influence, they basically together collude and build this second camp next door. And Wilhaus has a dog, a dachshund, and he names it Fritz after Gebauer. And then he'll swear at it and kick it and stuff, and then all his SS guys will laugh, because they know he's talking about. I mean, it's a complete goat rodeo, this place. But there are eventually women there. There's a women's camp of 5 barracks. No children to speak of. And when children do come into the camp, it's only to wait for a train to arrive to take them to an extermination center.
Awful. Does this camp remain today?
So it's really interesting. So the DAW side is a neighborhood, a mixed use neighborhood of small businesses and houses. So some of those buildings exist. The Zwangsarbeitslager, the forced labor camp, is still a prison today. And so after the war, the Soviets kept it as a prison. And then after the Soviet Union fell, the Ukrainians kept it as a prison. So today, ironically, it's penal colony number 30, and it's still making the same kinds of products that the DAW made under the Nazis, furniture and things like this. And if you look at the aerial photograph taken by the Luftwaffe in 1944, and you overlay it on the Google Earth image of the boundary of the prison, it's identical. Now, most of the buildings within that don't appear to be remaining from the war. So most of the above ground stuff is gone, with the exception of the camp headquarters building, which still exists. It's a multifamily home just outside of the prison.
I'm shocked by this. I would have assumed that this would have been turned into some sort of a memorial or a monument. As I understand it, that's the case of other concentration camps, detention camps, and so forth, that they've either been destroyed or turned like into monuments, right? Or not monuments, that's right. Memorials, probably the better places you can visit and learn.
Yeah, I mean, other places are, and but it also it's worth mentioning that the Auschwitz Memorial and Museum, that took time to develop as well. And so, for example, if you go to Birkenau today, one of the reasons that there's no or very few barracks remaining is that the Poles that live there came back and took the materials from the concentration camp to build their homes with, because the Birkenau was basically the Poles living in that area were forced to leave to build that camp, and so after the war, they came back and they needed building materials. They took it, right. So there wasn't kind of an immediate curtain that drops around all these places to protect them after the war. Even Auschwitz sort of develops into sort of a museum, and Dachau is another example, right? So Dachau immediately after the war, is a prison for Germans, for Nazis, and it serves as a camp for displaced persons, for Jews and other people that are sort of displaced, and then the Allies are trying to sort out what to do with them and where to send them, and they're kept there as well. But in the case of Yunovska, there's almost no commemoration of the site. There's a sign marking it. There's a stone that was put up by a survivor many, many years ago. But the site itself and the killing sites behind the camp, in the ravines just behind the camp, which is where these 80,000 people were shot to death, are not protected. I mean, it's protected as in sort of the zoning, right? So it's kind of zoned as a park city sort of area, but there's no sort of protection for the site. And on the one hand, you can sort of understand the Soviets show up and they need to put people in a camp, and there's a camp, so they put them there.
That's what's available. Sure.
This happens also at Sachsenhausen, just outside of Berlin. The Soviets create a special camp for first Nazis and then later on people that they want to put in prison. And of the 160,000 Jews from Lviv, at least in the immediate post-war time, about 800 Jews show up in Lviv after the war. And some of them may not have been residents of the city. That doesn't mean that only 800 Jews from Lviv survived, but it gives you a sense of the loss of the population there. This is a place that was the third largest Jewish population in Poland, and it was either scattered or destroyed. And so, one of the impacts of that is that it's a very basic one, which is that you don't have a population that is there to advocate for a memorial site. Yunovska was almost entirely a place of Jewish suffering. There were Poles and Ukrainians that were sent there, but it was more like they were sent there for fixed sentences for things, and they could get out. But that doesn't sort of demand commemoration in the same way that a Holocaust site does. And after the war, the Soviet narrative of World War II is one of oppression of the peace-loving communist citizens by the fascist occupiers. But they didn't want to differentiate any particularly Jewish suffering. It's a policy the policy that the Soviets sort of did is called "Do not divide the dead," and it was low key anti-Semitic, and it got more anti-Semitic as time went on, because they wanted everyone to be persecuted because they were communists, not because they were Jews. And again, they didn't want to recognize anything as particularly Jewish, because they felt that would give Jews some kind of sort of higher claim to sort of victimhood. And of course, in his waning years, Stalin becomes super anti-Semitic, which has a knock-on effect, in terms of commemoration. You can see this also at places like Babi Yar and elsewhere. So, take all of the challenges of memory and commemoration that you have in German camps and camps in occupied Poland, and then add to that all of what it means to be under the Soviets and to them not be interested. I mean, there's some, there's a guy named Vasily Grossman who wrote like a whole thing about the Holocaust, and that was sort of suppressed by the Soviets because they didn't want this. This was not a narrative that fit with the sort of literally the party line. So again, there's a challenge there of commemoration.
I was just looking at my Facebook memories. They pop up every so often to remind you of whatever, right? And sometimes it's awful. You're like, I don't want to see that ever again. This time, yesterday and today, it's been popping up a lot. 2 years ago today, I was in Prague. It's a place that I would move to tomorrow. I love that city so much. But when I was there, of course, you know this, there is an amazing Jewish quarter in Prague that was allowed to remain even under German occupation. But then, of course, the Soviets, took over the area for a very long time. And when I was there in 2022, one of the things that became very apparent was the very anti-Soviet feelings remaining to this day from that Soviet occupation. And I was like, wow, really blown away just how much vitriol there was, 30 years past the fall of the Berlin Wall. I mean, it was shocking to me how visceral those feelings really were. And that's, a bit removed from the area. I want to ask you, flipping back to the film, you back and rewatch this movie. Wait, was there stuff here when you were watching going, I really like what they did here? Were there parts of this film that you were like, I really like this aspect of what they're telling here when it comes to World War II and the Holocaust?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, I think the topic itself is really important because in most Holocaust film is sort of camp centered. If you think about the films, I mean, Schindler's List is basically a film about, I mean, there's ghetto stuff, but it's basically a film about a camp. Son of Saul is a film about a camp. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which no one should ever watch and should be thrown into a garbage bin, is also a film about a camp. Zone of Interest is a film about a camp. Many other films are about ghettos and ghetto experience or hiding, right? Or just Western European in general, right? There was that film that came out, or miniseries, I think it's called All the Light We Cannot See.
I've never seen it, but I've heard of
this.
Again,
it's about the Holocaust, sort of, but it's in the Netherlands. So just in terms of representation, I think it's really important that we recognize the place of Poland and the place, the Holocaust by bullets, which is only sort of it's given a very short moment in the film. Which, I mean, you can't have a whole film about people being shot into pits because that would be awful. But it's important to recognize that because, of the 6 million or so that were murdered during the Holocaust, over 2 million of them were murdered in these open air shootings in villages and in fields and forests and cemeteries. I mean, a massive number. And this is, a lot of it is before, the gas chambers open at Auschwitz or other places. The gas chambers, sort of the ones that we're sort of familiar with, for example, Sobibor, Treblinka, Belzec, Belzec only operates from March of 1942 to December of 1942. It's a relatively short period of time. But for lots of different reasons, all of these camps and ghetto experiences sort of dominate the cinematic world. and the cinematic sort of representation. And you don't get a lot of stories about or images of these other victims and this other victim experience. And one of the things that I like to say when I'm teaching students about the Holocaust is that it's not that 6 million Jews were killed. It's that one Jew was killed 6 million times, meaning that it's an individual experience. Everybody has a different experience of the Holocaust. It isn't just sort of this mass of people they flick a switch. And some of them are the Anne Frank experience, and some of them are, in a camp, and some of them are in a ghetto, and some of them, are in the forest. Some of them are murdered in death marches. Some die in the ghetto. Some are shot in these open air shootings. And so I think it's really important to show these open air shootings because these are not places that are sort of removed from their communities. They're not put on a train and taken to Treblinka and dead within 30 minutes of arrival. These people are shot within sight and sound of places they lived their entire lives, with everything that comes along with that, to include the neighbors, which I think is one of the things that's really, really powerful and effectively done in the film, is showing the complicity of neighbors. In this case, I think they were Poles. The guy or the guy who was the police chief or the militia chief, who they go kill his family, right? And I think that's really important too, because actually, when you listen to a lot of survivor testimony, for them, the Nazis are just kind of like a natural disaster. The Nazis show up and they kill Jews. That's what they do. And it's not that they don't bear them any animosity, but in their testimony, they become often most angry, upset, or distraught when they remember what their neighbors did. People they'd known, who had turned against them, or, not given them help, or done even worse, because that was a betrayal, which is different than Nazis. Like, Nazis are anti-Semitic. Nazis kill Jews. That's what they do, just in the same way that a forest fire burns forest. But
Nazis are invaders. These are your close friends.
Yeah, or not even close friends, but these are people that you at least wouldn't expect to sort of betray you in your hour of need. And so for many survivors, when they tell their stories, you can sort of see this is the thing that really just which hurt them the most in a certain sense. And I should caveat that by also saying one of the ironies of this is that while definitely the often latent anti-Semitism of local populations and their willingness to capitalize on what the Nazis were doing has to be countered with the fact that lots of people helped as well, and help came in a variety of different forms. And for every Jewish person that survived the Holocaust, escaping from the Nazis or escaping from local populations that were hostile, they survived because at least one or two or more different people helped them along the way. Whether it was sort of the full-on act of hiding them, or giving them a place to stay for one night, or giving them food or shelter or whatever along the way. So, again, complex, but the movie does a really good job just in that of showing the local complicity and the fact that sort of this guy knew them, right? And remember, I think they killed the people that had been hiding someone as well, right? Mm-hmm. At one point in the movie, if I remember correctly. Or the Nazis do. So it shows the both sides, the risk of hiding people and what that leads to. So I thought that was really good. I also thought something that bears mentioning is the complex position of non-Jewish inhabitants in the occupied Soviet Union when they are literally caught between the Nazis and the partisans. And there's a really good moment in the film, I think, when they show that with the guy that they want. I think they want to take milk from somebody. And the guy's like, this milk is for the Germans. And they're like, oh, we can't give it. And the partisans are saying, you can't give it to the Germans or we'll kill you. But the Germans are probably also saying, if you don't supply the milk, we're going to kill you. And this is actually really true. And so there are again, this gets to a really interesting challenge of the Soviet memory creation after the war. Because lots of people in occupied Soviet Union didn't have a great view of the partisans either. Because the partisans will come into their villages and steal stuff from them that they needed. And then ultimately, in some level, absolute value-wise, they're no different than the Nazis. They're taking their stuff. They're brutalizing them in many cases. Sometimes they are, just stealing. They're not even, they're just abusing their power in many ways the same way the Nazis are. And Belarus, of course, has its own. Belarus, the nation, its national myth is the sort of country of partisans, the home of the partisan. It's like, if there was a mascot for Belarus, it would be a partisan. But some of those partisans had been militia or police and had gone over to the partisans once they saw, the way the war is turning. And I interviewed a woman, not to pump my own podcast, but I interviewed a scholar, Francisca.
Absolutely, pump your own podcast.
Yeah, well, I interviewed a scholar, Francisca Exeler, a couple podcasts ago, because she wrote a whole book on this stuff and how the Soviets are in this really difficult place because after the war, some people were like trying to get recompense from the Soviet state for what the partisans had done to them. Which is problematic because this myth again of the all Soviet people being sort of united in their opposition to the Nazis, and then there are some partisans, very prominent partisans, who tout their partisanhood up, and then it turns out that they had been pretty bad collaborators, before they became partisans, and so then the Soviet state is trying to like figure out how do we can't have a high profile trial because then that sort of shows that actually the people weren't sort of 100% for us.
Sure.
So the movie does a really good job of in just a couple vignettes of showing, that the partisans weren't always kind and gentle, to the people, and they weren't always viewed as like heroes or saviors of the people because sometimes they would come in and take your stuff, and if they thought that you were collaborating with the Nazis, they could kill you or kill your family, and sometimes, for people in those situations, it wasn't as clear cut. Like if you were the guy who delivers the mail, and the Nazis show up, and you continue to deliver the mail, are you a collaborator with the Nazis? Are you? I mean, and
who are you? Right, totally.
I mean, under the Soviets, technically, yes. Like, they would always ask the question of why did you stay under the Nazis? So you automatically, just by living under the Nazi regime, you were sort of...
Why didn't you rebel, right? Oh my gosh.
Why didn't you leave, right? And so, some people were sort of swept up in that, and it makes things very complex. But then again, if you refuse to deliver the mail or you run to the forest and you're caught, the Nazis will kill you. So really complex depictions. I thought that was really good as well.
Yeah, these are really impossible. I think that maybe that's the strength here. Is like these are these impossible choices people are having to make. Do you try to gut it out? Do you flee to the forest? Where do you go? Like you said earlier, it's these lack of choices. You talk about your podcast that you're talking about, the Holocaust History Podcast. You're getting all of these amazing scholars on to the pod now to talk specifically about this, this event. Wait a minute, I didn't prompt you on this yet, but when we talk about this book here that you just wrote, Between the Wires, what's the other good stuff that people are responding to that maybe your students are responding to with the university? Or as you're reading, people, you think, wow, this is really good scholarship. People that want to learn more about the Holocaust or about the war. What's the stuff that's, that you're finding that's really moving you intellectually?
Well, one of the things that, and I have to confess, one of the motivations behind my podcast, the Holocaust History Podcast, is a very selfish one, which is that I feel like one of the things that I do as a scholar is like I'm not the best at trying to keep up with all of the amazing scholarship that I probably should be reading, on a regular basis. And so doing the podcast was great because it means that I have to, engage with and read and seek out, new work, and oftentimes in a variety of places that aren't in my sort of scholarly wheelhouse or something that I need to know because I work in that area. And the benefit to me is immense because I can hear and learn from other people because on my podcast, I don't say anything particularly smart. I just sort of, let the people that come on talk about the things that they're experts in.
It's a strategy I employ.
Yeah. I mean, like I'm a setter, right? I'm here I set the ball and I let them spike it. I'd rather go for the assist leader than the scoring leader. In that sense, I mean, there's lots of really amazing stuff that's being done. There's some examples. I'm just looking at the at the list of things that I've had on. I mean, it's a really wide sort of, because I'm not trying to do a chronological retelling of the Holocaust.
Sure.
I had a Christian Jennings on. He's a journalist. He's not an historian, but he talked about the Holocaust codes, which are basically, the fact that the British are reading all of these Nazi codes, and from them they're gleaning, what's happening, during the Holocaust. I just mentioned Francisca's work. I mean, that's really, really amazing stuff. There's a new book I'm having the author on soon, Jacob Flaws, about Treblinka. Really getting into, and it's called Spaces of Treblinka. But what's really cool about it is it's kind of focused in some ways on, well, it is focused on the sort of geographic elements, the spatial components, the sensory spaces of the camp. And by doing so, he gets at bystanders in a way that I haven't seen done in a lot of work, because it's people are smelling the camp. They are seeing the flames and the smoke. They are interacting with all the people that are escaping, jumping off of trains between Treblinka and wherever they're coming from, who sort of then end up interacting with the local population, literally along train tracks and this kind of stuff. So, I mean, there's a lot of really good stuff out there. People are doing lots of really good work. So, I mean, I'm not going to be able to answer all of the people that I've had on, talking about it. But I had Caroline Sturdy-Coles came on to talk about Holocaust archaeology and sort of how archaeology is dealing with the challenges of not being able to dig, but also having to find out, things about Holocaust sites and how you do that. So, I mean, there's a on the website for the podcast, there's a reading list. So I always ask my guests to recommend a book, and so they have a whole list of all the books that they've recommended as well, and some titles are repeated on there, and so that tells you ones that you should really check out. But I mean, there's always new things coming. And I just got back from sort of the preeminent world leading conference on the Holocaust called Lessons and Legacies, which is every 2 years. And, I left that conference with, just a renewed energy into sort of looking into what happened during the Holocaust in new ways. There's just really amazing things. Even, there was a panel of people doing large language model stuff, taking oral histories and doing lots of really smart things with figuring out, narrative arcs by looking at, what stories are told at what point in different testimonies, and, what emotions are coming out, and people were mapping testimony. I mean, just really amazing stuff. So, there's just like, I mean, and I think every field is like this. We're always learning new things, discovering new things, or thinking about new ways of looking at things that we thought we had covered, and then looking back, realize that we haven't done so.
Well, let me ask you this. On our final question here tonight, Waitman, like we think about all the ways the stories of the Holocaust are being told. Let's talk about this film here.
Yeah.
Is Defiance a history movie?
So there's the funny anecdote about this whole story. So when I was doing research for the first book, as I said, it's in Belarus. And essentially it's the structure of the first book is a series of case studies over time of the German army's behavior in a variety of different places. And one of the places was the town of Novogrudok. And Novogrudok is one of the towns and Lida, by the way, also, which is closely connected with the partisans and with the Bielski brothers. And when I visited Novogrudok to interview people and to sort of visit and to find the killing sites, I met up in the remains of the Jewish cemetery in the village of Novogrudok with a guy called Frank Kagan. And Frank Kagan was a Holocaust survivor. He was from, Jack Kagan. Wrong name. I don't know who Frank Kagan is. Jack Kagan. Jack was a survivor. He was from the town of Novogrudek. He ended up in the camp with the Bielski partisans by tunneling out of the barracks in the ghetto where he was confined. Ended up freezing his foot because he stepped in a like a trench full of water, and he lost toes as a result of it. But ends up he was with the Bielski brothers, and I was there in 2009, right?
Mhm.
So was that right when it came out? When did
Right, yeah, it comes out. Wide release is January 2009.
Yeah, so it had just come out, and Jack was this wonderful guy, kind of a short little guy standing there in the Jewish cemetery. And we were talking about all kinds of things. And I said, Jack, what do you think about this movie, Defiance, about the Bielski brothers? And he kind of looked at me and kind of shrugged, and he said, the truth was a lot more exciting. And so I thought that was like a really amazing way of commenting on the film from someone who had been there and lived it. Because I think the film may have many flaws, but I don't think not being exciting was one of them.
No, it's a very rewatchable film. Yeah.
I think, and this is the only rivet counting that I will do, is it sort of jumped the shark at the end, like the people like coming out of the swamp, facing German tanks, and that was a little much, right? I mean, it's just kind of like
battle never actually happened. You're right. Yeah.
Just unnecessary, that it just wasn't a thing. It was just dumb. It was just too much over the top. And I think that was part of what Jack Kagan was talking about. It's like, you didn't need that, because just the day-to-day things that they experienced and had to do to survive was already, in his words, sort of exciting enough. I think it is a history movie. I mean, maybe I was, I think about this question when I listen to your podcast, and it's almost like I almost think every movie is history. I almost think I'm never going to say it's not a history movie, because there's always something that we can take, unless it's Boy in Striped Pajamas, which, as I mentioned before, is complete shit. Have I mentioned it before?
And banned here on out from HATM.
Have I mentioned the Boy in Striped Pajamas? People, don't listen to that. Don't watch it. It's garbage. Don't read it. Don't let your children read it. If your school has bought like 100 copies and therefore assigns it, which is the thing that happens, like, please just go buy 100 copies of something else and give it to them, so that nobody ever reads that book. But I mean, most movies have like some truth to them, right?
Right.
Even if they're sort of over the top or like missing big things. But I actually don't think that there's a lot of big historical gaps in the movie. It tells the story from sort of a narrative from start to finish. It touches on, important elements of survival in that part of the world. Would I like to see a little bit more about the mass killings beyond just sort of people disappearing and then that one moment where they sort of stumble on the mass graves? Yes, but that may be just me as a Holocaust historian. I think the film contains enough sort of vignettes of these very complex things that we've been talking about already throughout the entire podcast episode. Things of how are non-Jews and Jews interacting? What does collaboration look like? What are the challenges of bystander behavior? What are the choices that non-Jews are forced to make in terms of helping or not? What are the complexities within the family camp, for example, of different people sort of all forced together? It's funny because one of the people that I write about in the Yanofsky book, a guy named Leon Wells, he's my favorite Holocaust survivor, by the way. Leon was 16. He escaped the camp twice. And then the second time he escaped was as part of the mass breakout where he helped kill a bunch of SS guys. But anyway, the reason I'm mentioning him is he ends up being hidden by a Polish family in Lviv, in a false basement under a barn, along with like 20 other people. So there's like 20 people in this basement, and he writes about this. I think it's him. Anyway, one of the survivors writes about this. And what's crazy about it is that there's like this lawyer and his wife, and she's just a complete jerk. Like, nobody likes her. And so like she's getting on everybody's nerves, and like I think that's so human, right? Because of course, like if you take 20 people and stick them in a basement, they're not all gonna get along, and it's gonna be really annoying
No.
and really difficult. And the same thing you see in the family camp, that this isn't just a sort of a kumbaya around the campfire. There are lots of different people who have lots of different thoughts and beliefs and have come from different backgrounds, but they do end up working together, and not in like a Scooby-Doo kind of way, but in like a realistic kind of way. I think the other thing that I think is really important that we haven't really talked about, but a scene that's really important, is when they go into the ghetto and they're talking to the Jewish council, and they're like, "You guys need to escape because the Nazis are here to kill you all." And the leader of the Jewish council is like, "Yeah, but I mean, we have all these old people and children, and like, it's not as easy to just you're strong men of military age, in the forest. Like that's great for you, but like we can't just all escape from the ghetto, and if we do try to escape, it might cause Nazis to come in and kill us all immediately."
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really powerful and important moment in the film, because it really shows the viewer that, even when kind of what's happening, these leaders are in this terrible situation of having to try to, they're responsible to the Nazis for policy and for obeying what the Nazis are going to make them do in the service of and the welfare of their own people. And so, there are many places in many ghettos where the ghetto leadership is like, we don't really want to support resistance right now, because we have to care for all these old people and children and sick people and everything else, and we can't risk angering the Nazis even further and having them come in and take reprisal action on us. And so even in that sense, and then as I mentioned, not everyone can just run to the forest. Like that's a hard life, and just getting to the forest is difficult. And so that moment, is a good one of showing sort of the challenges for people left behind, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
you have the Belsky brothers, and that's great, but most Jews in Belarus don't survive in the forest, and many of them because they can't flee to the forest, or because they're caught up in that first wave of killings, right? And so I think the film is a history film. I think it shows the history as well. Yes, it's got some sort of Hollywood moments and that kind of stuff, but I mean, as I've gotten older, I've mellowed out a little bit, and like, okay, like we can have some of that. It's all right.
They're movies.
I mean, you can't have just. I mean, you can. There are movies that do that, and it's important not to manufacture good feelings in Holocaust films, I think. But I think it's okay if they exist to sort of show them. I mean, gosh, if anybody's listening who is a Hollywood person, Yanofsky deserves a film, because there's some amazing resistance, that takes place, in that place as well. And I'll be happy to sort of advise that film, and I'll even allow some Hollywood in it.
That works. Wait a minute. We've all been part of a mass movement over to Blue Sky from Twitter. I know some people still have Twitter accounts and stuff like that, but there's been more and more activity over there. Where do people find you now when they want to engage with you?
Yep. So I'm still on the Twitter, because my argument is that I'm not the one that sucks. Elon is the one that sucks. But I am on Blue Sky more and more. My handle on Blue Sky is waitmanwbeorn.com, because I figured out how to make it basically my website as my name. I'm on Twitter as @WaitmanB. The Holocaust History Podcast is on Twitter @HolocaustPod. You can also Google it. It has its own webpage and everything. It doesn't have a Blue Sky yet, though. Now that Blue Sky is open to everybody, I probably should just make one.
It's coming, yeah. Awesome. I know it's late where you are, buddy. Thank you so much. We got to get more Northumbria people. Your university is leading the pack here of representation.
Yeah, we are.
So we got to figure. I'm gonna have to get some. What do they have? Jerseys? They don't do T-shirts over there, do they? What do they do? The football jerseys? Is that what people? What
the nice thing is, like, like British universities don't do the whole sports thing. So,
Right.
there's much less sort of money spent on branded
I gotta
material.
get some swag from Northumbria. Is my point.
You want some swag?
I gotta get something. I gotta get some swag. I gotta get a shirt or something like that. At this
I'll
point
hook
in
you
time,
up.
I've had so many people on.
I'll hook you up.
So, all right, buddy. Wait, man. Next time we're doing something fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. This is fantastic.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies podcast. Thank you so very much to our guest, Waitman Beorn. You can find Waitman anywhere you want on the internet. He is easy to find. And of course, thank you to my brother, Fletcher Powell, for being here and producing this show. Most importantly, thank you to all of you for continuing to be here and being part of the HATM community. You mean the absolute world to me. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. We have so many more podcasts coming your way shortly. So I hope you keep subscribing, keep listening, and keep sharing this with your friends. And we will talk to you a little bit later. Ciao for now. Bye.